Hey guys, welcome back to another Houdini Adventure. Today we take a look at a realistic slow motion fluid splash as you see on screen. Inside of Houdini, we begin by importing the Lime model and scale it down to match the real world scale. So in my case I used the file SOP and it comes with a bunch of models like the full, the half, the slice, but we only need the full Lime, so we just keep that and transform it down. Because we're working in meters, we have to scale it by 0.01, so now it should be the real world scale. So this is now our model imported into our scene. So let's create a camera and start animating our Lime. I already created a camera with a focal length of 75 and created a small animation. So it's just the Lime flying through the frame and having a little bit of a rotational spin to it. I animate it in real time. I also want to cache it, simulate the fluids in real time and add a retime sub after both of them who are controlled by the same float value. So in order to better animate it, you can actually split your views. I like to do it like this, and now you have this top one for the perspective. You can see how it's moving, behaving in perspective, but you can always have an eye on your camera. How does it look in camera? Because that's the most important part. And I would always say, before you animate anything, try to import your camera, try to set a camera you want, and then start animating from there. And always keep an eye on how it looks in your frame, but also is it realistically flying in perspective. Once we are happy with our camera and animation, we can start with our flip fluid simulation. You first have to create an emitter. I just use a sphere on the top right of my frame. Now I create a new dot network, call it flip fluids 2, because I already have my other one, and dive inside. What we need is a little bit of gravity, a flip object, and a flip solver. We plug those in, and it gives us a cube by default. On our flip object, we want to use the surface SOP and point it to our emitter sphere. So inside of our splash emitter, out emitter. Now let's set the particle separation to a lower value, like 0.001, because we're working with a real scale value. Keep in mind that the default values of the flip object, flip solver, are created for large-scale simulations. This is why we have to work with quite low values in this tutorial. Now let's go to the flip solver, and on the volume motion tab, let's lower our box size. Everything in this box will be simulated, and it's set to 50 by 50 by 50 meter. We have this really small scale simulation and we don't need to calculate that much, so it's even faster if we shrink it down. And now you can see that we have this sphere with our particles inside. These particle spheres are right now sprites and quite big. We can just go to our flip object and under guides, set the particles instead of visualization sprites to particles. Now, in order to see if everything's working, let's just create a ground plane and merge it in. Careful that we have our effector relationship in the merge is set to left inputs affect right inputs. You can just deactivate it by set it to mutual, but I will just keep it that way right now, and let's just press play. And that already works for us. Perfect. So we don't need the ground plane. Let's go to our flip object, and under the initial data you can set an initialize velocity. and I want to shoot my particles against my line. So I already tried out and have values for that. Those are -1, 0.53 and 0.63. Now let's see what happens if we press play. You can see that we are throwing this sphere in this direction. Now we need to add our lime as a collider. The easiest way to do so is with the shelf tools. You can just select your lime and then go to Deforming Object under the Collision tab. It will create this static object in here and a static solver and merge it in with your flip fluid setup. You can do that also manually. Just be sure that you check the Use Deforming Geometry, because this will make sure that you import your animated lime as a collider. Before you now press play, maybe once check the volume collision. You can turn on the collision guide and then just check if it's a good representation of your object, or if you want to have more subdivision, more detail, you can just lower this division size. But I think I'm good with 0.001. Now let's turn that off. Just one more thing I want to do before starting Simulate. My flip solver, I will put my time scale to 0.4. So now let's press play and see how it looks like. We have that really nice splash. But in order to get the right look, we have to adjust a few parameters. The first thing which is really necessary in order to retime it later on our flip solver under the particle motion, we have to turn off the reseed particles. This will add particles over time to compensate volume loss. But if we add particle over time and have not a static particle count, it will be really difficult to retime. And also on our flip solver, under the behavior tab, we want to add ID attributes. If we take a look at our simulation now with all the standard values, it's very splashy and we don't have any kind of surface tension at all, which is quite characteristic for a small scale fluid. So under this flip solver, volume motion tab, there's the surface tension tab. Let's enable the surface tension. And 10 might be a bit too much for our small scale simulation. Let's put that to 0.1 and just have a look what happens. You can see that our sphere is actually getting squeezed in way too much from the beginning. But that not necessarily means that we have to lower our surface tension. The surface tension actually needs a little bit of substeps. So on our flip solver, let's just put the minimum substeps to 4 and maximum substeps to 8. Now let's see what happened. You can see that it's already doing a way better job than before. But it's still a little bit too much. Now under the flip solver, volume motion, and you can also enable the surface tension blur. When you do that, it should do an even better job. You can see that we still have our sphere now, but then once it's colliding with our lime, it creates this really nice surface here, and it looks way more like a small scale splash. What I also like about that, if we zoom in a bit, you can see that we first have this surface here, we have this crown splash, and then later on these small things get generated. So the water is breaking apart. So that already looks way better. But because we can't turn on reseed, you can see that we have quite a few holes in our particle simulation. We can tackle that by just going to the flip solver and then under the particle motion separation. So if we apply particle separation, you will take a look at all those particles and see if some of them are on each other. So each particle has a p-scale, and they might come closer together than their actual p-scale. And to just give it a little bit more uniform look and to kind of fill these holes a little bit better, you can turn on this particle separation. So now let's have a look at this. And you can already see the particle separation effect. So it's distributed more even and a little bit smoothed out. And that will help us when we later mesh it. And before we had this, there are quite a few holes in there. If we are happy with the look, let's just lower the particle separation even more. I put mine to 0.0005. And on our dot network, we want to higher the substeps from 1 to 8. We need all these in-between position information of our fluids to have a better quality retime in the end. So when we import everything from our dot network, on our file cache node, we can actually set the substeps to 8 as well. So it looks something like this in your browser. You have the first frame and you have it 8 times for each substep. Then the second frame. And our retime node later can read all these substeps information and use it to have a better quality retime. In order to understand it better, I've prepared a little example to show you exactly why we need those in-between information. Here I have a simple sphere and an RUD bullet solver. So the sphere is falling down. Once I have cached it with just one substep and the other one with 10. And on our retime node, then I use just the one substep, and on the other one, I use it with 10 substeps. So if I just take the slider, frame slider, you can see that with one substep, it's actually not colliding very correctly with the ground, and the whole movement is quite smooth because it's interpolating between the information it has. But then on the second one, we have way more. So we have 30 frames times 10. So 300 files are generated, and it's getting all its data from there to retime it. And you can see that it's really bouncing and hitting the ground, and we have a little bit more to work with. And this is why we do the same thing with our fluid. So once I cached it with 8 substeps, it looks something like this. And now I use the retime sub and put it to evaluation mode by frame, and our input frame range is 30 and our substeps are 8. I turn off the use velocity when input interpolating position. We just want to get interpolated by the in-between position information. So I use the same retime sub on our line. So you can see here on our animated lime, I created an ID attribute on our points, which is just the ptnum, and then I also retime it. I only want to retime the position, so our UVs and everything else stays the same. So I connected a control null with a float value called frame to both of those retime nodes. So I can go in here and then just retime it from outside, and I can see both objects. So if I now go to my splash and also to my lime, and I take my control, you can see that I now have the whole thing being retimed, and it works really well. So once it's hitting the line with our splash, the slow motion effect starts. Over the course of 4 seconds, we have the slow motion, and then it's getting fast in the end again. So in order to render that correctly with motion blur, we need our velocity, and we also need to mesh our splash. So on the splash, after we retimed it, I use a trail sub to compute its velocity again. And then I create the meshing. So I use the VDB from particles. You can also use the particle fluid surface, but I like to do it with the VDB workflow, which gives me a little bit more control. So I usually use the reshape SDF and then set its operation to close. So before I closed it, you can see all the particles, and when you close it and play with the offset, you can see that it's becoming more like a surface, which we then can smooth and convert that to polygons again. Now, with this meshing, we lose the velocity data. So we can get it back by just using an attribute transfer, and at the attributes, I just want to transfer the velocity. And this is our out splash. On my setup, I usually also create a render container. So these render containers is just a little bit more clean, so we all know what's being rendered in the end. And in here, I pulled in the animated lime, and on the splash, I pulled in the splash. So on here, because on our container, we usually set the materials. So I have a water material and my lime material. And also for the lime, I use the redshift object tessellation and displacement, since we have a displacement map. For the splash, we want to go to redshift object and then use the mesh deformation blur from velocity attribute to get the right motion blur. So let's take a look at our materials. So I have two materials, one water material and one for the lime. The water is just a standard redshift material with the water preset applied. And the lime, we thankfully got all the texture maps we need, like diffuse, roughness, normal map, displacement. And the only thing you have to do is dial in some radius scale, play around with it, and it looks already really photorealistic. So just in case you want to play around with this asset as well, I will drop you a link to our CG Trader. This is our asset collection, and you can see that we have a lot of scanned food, really photorealistic assets in here. And you can see that all of these are also retopologized with a nice texture, 8K texture map, and yeah, they look really great also in close-up. So in case there's any need for you to play around with those assets, or you need any of them for your projects, I will drop you the link below. So after that, let's just have a quick talk about the lighting. I have 3 lights. So one top light, I think, which is especially important. I can quickly show you this was also the first light I created. Then go with that. Let me quickly just turn on each separately. You can see what they are doing, how they add a little bit of light to it. So the first one is the top light. Then we got our key light from the left, and also a little bit colder light from the right. And once I rendered that, it looked something like this. So if you want to stay up to date on projects we make or new asset that we create, you can also find us on Instagram. I will drop a link below. There you can see that I already posted the splash and also the new asset which are coming in, and a few style frames of them. So it will be really happy if you could leave a like there, and thanks a lot. Hope you've understood everything, and if you have any questions, please leave comments under this video, or you have any suggestions on how to create a better looking splash, or even different techniques, just let us know in the comments, and see you next time.